You guys, I am so excited about today's show. I've got Dr. William Hasker with me to talk about open theism. Let me tell you why I'm so excited about this. First of all, I was preparing for a talk that I was giving on the problem of evil, and I picked up Dr. Hasker's book, The Triumph of God Over Evil, and it was just, he was making a case for open theism that I was not expecting in the first place, but it was really, really interesting. Super interesting. And so that led me to buy this other book by Hasker. At least he's a contributing author here. Contributed a chapter called A Philosophical Perspective, basically kind of tying everything together in an analytic way, which is something I really appreciate, is the way that as I was reading this book, actually, which I've got linked in the description of this video. As I was reading this book, I was like, man, some of these authors, like the points, I'd like to be able to engage more with their work intellectually, but when I finally started to read Dr. Hasker's chapter, I was like, okay, this is where it's all at. This is where the analytic thinking kind of comes into play. Everything is super clear. He's like highlighting different points of controversy, but then laying it out in a very systematic and analytic way. I just really appreciated it. And today, what we're doing again is we're talking about open theism, and I'm giving Dr. Hasker a chance to really defend this view, because I don't think it really gets a fair hearing on the internet, on YouTube, or really anywhere else. A lot of our followers, a lot of people who are subscribed to this channel are big Dr. Craig fans. I am as well. As you know, he's a Molinist, and so he has some things to say about open theism that are not always the nicest. And I've even got a clip we're going to play a little bit later from Dr. Craig, and we're going to get some interaction from Dr. Hasker on. But anyways, thank you so much, Dr. Hasker, for coming on the show. It's great to have you here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Right. So let's get right into it. Let me just introduce, for those of you who don't know who Dr. Hasker is, he's a philosopher. He's published many different, I held up the books here. As you can see, I'm kind of on a Hasker kick lately, but he's written The Openness of God. At least he's contributed a chapter there. And then The Triumph of God Over Evil, which is one of the best books on the problem of evil I think you can pick up and read. So definitely pick up those two works. But let's start with this question. And you said it was okay to call you Bill, so I'm going to call you Bill. Is it what first attracted you to open theism? What was it?
Well, what really got me started thinking in this direction was a very famous and seminal article by Nelson Pike, a philosopher of religion, who set out in a very compelling way the argument that complete and certain divine foreknowledge is incompatible with humans having free will. This was in I think about 1974. If I believe that's about right. And that argument, which I hadn't really come to grips with before, that struck me as quite compelling and quite forceful. And so I began looking more deeply into the issue and to the various answers that were proposed to this argument. And finally, I wrote an article in Faith and Philosophy entitled Foreknowledge and Necessity. And then this was sort of the framework for the book published in 1989 by Cornell University Press, God, Time, and Knowledge. And that laid down the sort of the theoretical framework for it, but most of which I still, with some changes, but most of it I still endorse. So that's how I got started on it.
So I'm seeing in the live chat a lot of you are commenting, what is open theism? And actually, you're in for a treat. What we're about to do is go through 5 different alternatives to basically God's nature and his relationship to the created order. That's what this is kind of all about. Open theism is about the nature of God and his relationship to the creatures that he creates. So there's 5 different views that we're going to look at today. I'm going to get a summary of the overview of each view from Dr. Hasker, and he's going to provide just like a summary of his objections to those other views. And then open theism is going to be the last one that we look at, and then we're going to address some objections to open theism a little bit later on, including a clip from Dr. Craig. So you want to stick around for that part. But let's get to it. So the first one is process theology. Tell me about, well, let me actually run through all five, and then we'll start with process theology. So the first one is process theology. Second one is Calvinism. The third one is Molinism, which you've probably heard of. Well, you've probably heard of both Calvinism and Molinism. Process theology, we'll get to that one. Simple foreknowledge is the fourth one, and then open theism is the last one. And sometimes it's just called well, there's different names that it goes by, but open theism is the one that I think most people are familiar with. So let's go back to process theology. What is that view? What are some of your objections?
Process theology is a view that is really heavily based on a form of philosophy and metaphysics developed by Alfred North Whitehead, a very famous British intellectual and philosopher in the early part of the 20th century. The system is too complicated to spell out in detail here, but in relation to the nature of God, the most important feature is at least from the standpoint of all traditional theology, a major limitation on God's power, on what God is able to do. A key formulation is that God's power is always persuasive, never coercive, which is to say, God suggests to creatures, created things, the best way that they can go, the best way that they can develop or change. But he doesn't control what they actually do. And so what the creature, say it's a human being, what we actually decide to do in a situation may be something quite different and opposed to what God wanted us to do, and so to speak, whispered in our ears that we ought to do. And this has big implications. It means there's no creation out of nothing. Creation always supposes already existing world. There are not miracles in the usual sense, because God can't just step in and make something happen. He has to have cooperation and so on. I think, well, basically, I mean, my objection to this is one that I suspect you and many of your readers will share, that this just deviates way too far from what we in the Bible and in the Christian faith understand God to be. And I don't myself think that there are good enough reasons for adopting this metaphysical view that devised by Whitehead. So that one is, as far as I'm concerned, is pretty much off the table.
It's just a little bit too much.
Yeah, it's giving
going
up
too
too
far.
much, and I don't see there's a good reason for it. Okay. Now, Calvinism or theological determinism, this is a view that does have quite a few supporters within the Christian church. It's a view that simply God decides everything that's going to happen, and that's what happens. You know, it's all simply playing out the script that God has decided to have happen. Free
Would you
will
say,
means that.
Do you mind if I jump in just really quickly to kind of contrast these two views? Process theology seems kind of like the antithesis or like the exact opposite of Calvinism. Would you agree?
I think that's fair to say. That's fair to say. And the process theists like to make a lot of that, and how bad Calvinism is in their view, so which makes their view look a lot better. Of course, there are a few alternatives in between there.
Right.
But the drastic contrast, yeah. And so for Calvinism or theological determinism, everything happens just as God has decreed for it to happen. Many people find this reassuring and comforting. I don't. It means that all the terrible things in the world happen just because that's the way God wanted them to happen. This is exactly what God was planning for. That's exactly what he wanted. You may ask, well, how can humans be responsible for what they do? Well, they just are. I mean, the Calvinists don't see that there's a conflict there. The thing that, in a way, is even more bothersome, if we accept this viewpoint, then it looks as if God must be completely pleased and delighted with everything that happens, because that's exactly the way he wanted it. If he wanted it any different, then it would have been different. Nothing keeps God from getting exactly what he wants. So he must, since God is not irrational, he must believe, he must be completely pleased with everything that happens. But it's hard to think of anything that is more clearly in conflict with the Bible than that, right? I mean, the Bible presents God as being very unhappy about some of the things that happens, even angry, even wrathful. God does not simply approve of everything that happens, but that's something that Calvinists have to work over. So for me, Calvinism isn't a live option at all, but there are certainly many devout Christians who accept it.
There's actually a quote, if you don't mind, there's actually a quote that I'd like to get to. And also, I've noticed that, so in the live chat, a lot of you are saying that my audio is a lot louder than Dr. Hasker's. So I've turned mine down. I can't turn Dr. Hasker's up at all, but I'm turning mine down quite a bit. So let me know if this is a little bit better of a balance. You may just have to turn up the loudness of your speakers. But I've got a quote that I'd like to read, and this is about Calvinism. And it was just a really good question, I think, that Calvinists need to answer. So let me just get to it. We believe, and this is by we, you're talking about all the different authors, contributors in this book. We believe that God is completely capable of creating a universe, every detail of whose history is solely determined by his sovereign decree. But it seems to us that a wise and good God would not want, and in fact has not chosen, to create such a universe. We in turn would ask the Calvinists, is God as you conceive of him unable to create a world in which there are free creatures who voluntarily enter into a relationship of love and friendship with him? Or does he prefer a world in which he alone monopolizes control, leaving nothing to be decided by his creatures? And why should we think that he would prefer a world like that? I felt like that kind of encapsulates maybe one of your primary objections.
Well, that is a great point. No, I think that's true. Because Calvinists are likely to think, well, a non-Calvinistic God is wimpy. He can't control things. He's not in control. And so what we say, as far as power is concerned, the God in open theism has all the same power that God, according to Calvinism, has. But we don't think that God has chosen to use that power in the way that the Calvinists think God has chosen. So it's not a question of the greatness of God's power, but how God has chosen to use the power. And so I think that is an important point. Thank you for reading the quotation. Yeah.
Well, let's now turn to, let's contrast Calvinism with Molinism.
Okay. Molinism is a much more subtle viewpoint. Molinism says we do have free will, in that in many situations there are two or three or more, maybe many more alternatives things that we could do. And it's in our power to choose which of these to do. Well, then you might say, well, then how does God know what you're going to do? Well, according to the Molinists, there are certain truths. They're called counterfactuals of freedom. They're counterfactuals because they describe what would happen in various circumstances. And these counterfactuals, for each person, say for me, the counterfactual says what in fact I would freely choose to do in a given situation in which I might find myself. Okay, so to take a trivial example, I have my choice of strawberry, vanilla, or chocolate ice cream for lunch. Okay, now it's completely in my power to take any of these, or maybe I don't want ice cream at all. Okay, but I have alternatives. It's in my power to choose one or the other. But there is a counterfactual of freedom which says that given that choice, I would freely choose chocolate. Although it's perfectly possible for me to choose one of the others, vanilla or strawberry, I would in fact freely choose chocolate. So God, knowing that I'm going to have this choice of ice cream for lunch, God also knows the relevant counterfactual, and the counterfactual tells them that if I'm given that choice, I will choose chocolate. Okay? So God is able to know beforehand exactly what I will do, even though I'm completely free to make the choice. Now
So let
that's
me,
really sneaky, really
yeah,
tricky. Okay?
one of my
And
questions, one of my questions here, I think it's going to invite some clarity as well, is that you've mentioned the counterfactual of freedom, and to me, I feel like that may be not the best word to use because in some cases, for example, it's suppose that
right,
God foreknew that Peter was going to deny him 3 times, but then that actually happened, and so it's not a counterfactual. That's actually just what happened.
right.
It's not counter to fact.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. The expression which has become entrenched, it is a little bit misleading that way because it also applies to the situations that actually do happen. So a more accurate description would be these are subjunctive conditionals of freedom. They say if Hasker were to be in such and such a situation, then he would do so and so. But the important point is that there exist these truths concerning each one of us and concerning any possible situation in which we might find ourselves making a choice, most of which never happen at all. But any possible situation is covered by this. Furthermore, there are these counterfactuals concerning lots of individuals who might exist or might have existed, but never in fact do exist. But for them also, there are all these counterfactuals of freedom. And so this is very handy from the standpoint of divine providence, because it means that God, without interfering with our freedom, and we have complete freedom, we have freedom in many, many situations, but without interfering with that freedom, God is able to know beforehand how we would respond to any situation. And so God is able to plan out the whole thing, the whole course of history, in fact, using these subjunctive conditionals or these counterfactuals of freedom.
Dr. Craig calls it God is an actualizer, but then we're sort of co-actualizing whatever world takes place.
That's a, if he said it, I'm sure it's right. No, that sounds right. Yeah. Thomas Flint, who's one of the leading theorists of this, calls this libertarian traditionalism. It's libertarian because it says that we do have libertarian freedom. It's really in our power to do any of a number of different things, which hasn't always been, of course, affirmed in the tradition. But it's traditionalist in that it supports a traditional view of divine providence in which the whole scenario is completely planned out in advance by God, and God can be absolutely certain of getting exactly what he wants. Now, the main objection, or one main objection to this, is that there aren't any such truths as these. There can't be. There's nothing, they're not based on anything. There's nothing to make them true. There's no truth maker, as philosophers talk about it. We'll be coming back to this later, so I won't go into it further right now, but
this is such a crucial point here. I want to overemphasize it with the audience because it really opened my eyes to being like, okay, this is why open theism is like a legitimate option. If this is your view, that you don't think that there are such counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, which it's I also want the audience to know there's a huge debate in philosophy of religion right now over whether or not there are such counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. So it's not just that, like, you know, when you hear Dr. Craig talking about this, it might seem like, you know, this is just a view that doesn't have a whole lot of issues. But I mean, we even had debates on this channel where it's a very controversial subject is the only thing that I want to say. And so it's a completely, I think, legitimate option. If you find those arguments persuasive, it's a legitimate option to be like, well, there are no counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, which then if God, you know, if those are impossible, if it's impossible to know what a free creature would do in any given situation, then that's not an item of knowledge God has. So it's not like it's taking away from God's omniscience. That's what really kind of opened my eyes. That like you're not degrading God's abilities, you're not degrading God's power or his omniscience or anything. You're just saying that, you know, this counterfactual, these subjunctive conditionals of creaturely freedom, there's nothing to ground them, there's nothing to make them true, so to speak, so they just don't even exist. And so that if that is your view, if you're persuaded by those arguments, then it just kind of, and we're gonna get to open theism in just a little bit, but I felt like that is super important to emphasize, and that's what really opened my eyes to why philosophers are motivated that way. And it's not just philosophers; it's Christians who are not heretics. Okay, anyways, I'm kind of getting on a rant here. Let's continue. Yeah, so pick up wherever you'd like to.
You're exactly right, and I think. I honestly, I believe that among philosophers who have considered this issue, I believe that a very strong majority are against the counterfactuals of freedom. I think both Christian philosophers and secular philosophers. Now, that majority view doesn't settle questions in philosophy, but it's
well. You've also got to contend with the fact that Alvin Plantinga is a Molinist, and so that you may.
Yeah, he sort of reinvented it, right? But
his vote counts for about 50.
Even Alvin Plantinga can't establish philosophical truth by decree. But Nick Wolderstorff, Alvin's best buddy, is an open theist. He decided. I called Nick up on the phone once and asked him what he thought about Molinism. Well, he admitted he hadn't really made up his mind about it. So he thought about it and he decided he didn't think it was right. So, okay.
Yeah, anyway, Wolterstorff he's a beast as well. So, yeah, okay. All right, well, let's continue. Let me situate the audience really quickly where we've got. If you're just joining us, we've talked about process theology, Calvinism, Molinism. We talked about objections to each of these that Dr. Hasker has. The last two that we're going to discuss, simple foreknowledge, and then we're going to get to open theism and what that view is.
Right. So simple foreknowledge says, and this is has been a pretty widely held view. God simply knows the future. But without, what makes it simple is no counterfactuals of freedom. Okay, he just knows the actual future.
What will happen?
People who hold this think that it's possible for God to know the future and we do have free will. However, the future is what he knows, not the hypothetical futures based on all these what-if questions. Now, an interesting thing about this is that this kind of knowledge, unlike Molinism or middle knowledge, is of no use to God in conducting the affairs of the world. It's of no use to God whatsoever. Because think of it like this. Suppose God has in front of him the complete, which he does understand, the complete story of everything that's going to happen. What can God do about it? The answer is nothing. Nothing. Because at this point, all the things that will happen, including God's own actions in the future, are already incorporated into the story. There's nothing left to be decided. As far as making a difference, it's always already too late. So I think when you realize this, and people struggle with this, but when you realize this, simple foreknowledge is not a very attractive option because it doesn't give you anything in terms of God, divine providence, or God's ability to govern the world. Now, open theism, the most.
I'm trying not to interrupt too much. I did want to ask something about because we just sort of did a quick overview of simple foreknowledge, and I wanted to ask you a question about, or really just because as I was reading the book, which let me talk about it one more time, the openness of God. You can see it on my screen here. Got it linked in the description of this video. You talked about open. There's so many different options. Simple foreknowledge, and one of the things that you said kind of helped me understand what the main issue is that philosophers have with this view is that it's kind of mysterious. How, if God doesn't have middle knowledge, how can he still know the future completely, what free creatures will do?
Yeah, sure. And that's an inherent problem, you know. You can think of it as God sort of looks into a crystal ball and there's the future. But how does it get in the crystal ball? Or you could think of it in terms of backwards causation. Maybe the future event causes God's past knowledge, but that future event doesn't exist. And there's nothing that says that it's going to exist one way or another. So how can it cause God to know something in the past? So yeah, that's an inherent, huge problem with this kind of view. It is, yes.
Okay, so now we're finally ready to move to open theism. It's only taken us half an hour.
Yeah. Well, open theism says simply that the future doesn't exist insofar as the future depends on human free choices. There's nothing in the past or present that guarantees that it's going to be one way, in particular way. Now, there are factors that make some future events probable and others very improbable, but that's all you can get is probabilities. And so what God has complete knowledge of the past and present, and in view of that is he has incredible wisdom concerning what is likely to happen in the future, but it doesn't amount to complete and certain knowledge because this is inherently impossible. Again, we're not taking something away from God. We're saying that's the nature of the future, that it can't be known. There isn't anything there to know. As soon as there's something to know, God will be the first to know it, okay? But until something resolves the ambiguity of what kind of ice cream I'm gonna have for lunch, there's no fact of the matter for anyone to know. So it's not that God is ignorant, it's just that there isn't anything there to know. But God has tremendous wisdom in guiding the course of events, and guiding guiding the way things develop, in guiding human beings. And so God is able to work for his purposes in the world and see them go forward. And God, in the end, can act unilaterally if he wishes. The final judgment is not going to come about by people voting to have the final judgment, right? The final judgment will come about because God has decided to bring this about. But many of the details of how things will work out between now and the end, these things just don't exist. And so there's nothing to be known. And so we understand, we want to understand God and God's relation to the world and God's relationship to the people in this light. And that, that leads me to say that open theism puts a lot of emphasis on God's openness to us, in the sense that God is open and receptive and interactive with us. If you read the Bible, God is intensely interacting with people, with getting them to do what he wants, persuading them, sometimes getting angry with them. But God is very much involved. And we open theists take this very seriously. Calvinists in particular don't go along with this. They're quick to say, well, God is baby talking. When God talks about this isn't serious. This isn't the way it really is. God really is this perfectly composed, aloof, sovereign, detached person. And whatever in the Bible leads you not to think that is simply God accommodating himself to your limited understanding. But the true God is the God that we Calvinists tell you about. Well, no, we open theists think that the true God is the God the Bible tells us about. And this is a God that is very interactive, very personal.
He wants everyone to be saved.
Emotionally involved with us. So that's a quick summary, but I'm open to what you want to ask about it.
We're going to get to some objections to open theism a little bit later, and we've already even had a super chat that was sent in with an objection. So we're going to get to some objections to open theism. It's not as if this is an uncontroversial subject at all. There's objections to every single view. William Keller asks, will there be a Q&A? And that is not the right question. Let's see if I can get the right one there. Will there be Q&A? Yes. The answer is yes. We're going to try to do some Q&A a little bit later. There are a few other different questions that I've got for Dr. Hasker as we're going through today. One of the questions that I want to get to really quickly is, how do these different views handle or deal with the problem of evil? And the reason why I'm asking this is because this is kind of what sparked this interview, to remind the audience really quickly the triumph of God over evil. You were sort of giving a sort of implicit case for open theism that I found really intriguing when you were talking about how is God, what's his relationship to evil and all of that. So how do these different views that we've discussed, how do they interact with the problem of evil?
Okay, very quickly, process theism accords quite little power to God. And so if God has very little power, then God can't be very much to blame for the evil that happens. And they think, the process theists think this is a huge advantage of their view. Well, so far it is an advantage, but as we said before, I think they give up way too much for getting that advantage. So again, that's not on the table. Calvinism, in my opinion, has an enormous, and I think insoluble conflict over the problem of evil. I mean, evil is simply the evil that's in the world is the way God decided for the world to be. Can it really be evil? if this is what God wanted, can you make sense of that? Can it make sense of the fact that God judges and even damns people for doing the evil that he has foreordained and ensured that they should do? I don't think there's anything approaching a decent solution there. As as I mentioned before, simple foreknowledge is in the same position as open theism on this, although some adherents of simple foreknowledge don't realize that, but that's the fact. So it comes down to open theism and Molinism as maybe the two main options here. Open theism has a very distinct advantage in that we are not saying that God has planned and ordained for all the evil that happens in the world. God does what God can do to bring about good outcomes and to avoid evil outcomes. And that's a lot. God has done an enormous amount. And of course, the ministry, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ and the Church of Christ is an important part of what God has done. But God has not in detail decreed or even foreseen all of the specific examples of evil. And in fact, we believe that God suffers. And this is another contrast with the classical view. God suffers. The Bible presents God as suffering. Read the book of Hosea, and God's suffering as the husband of his faithless wife, Israel. What hurts us hurts God. God suffers along with us as well as rejoicing with us. So it seems to us that this presents a constructive and healthy way of viewing the problem of evil. And we have the assurance that in the end, in the eschaton, God will ultimately triumph over evil. Evil will no longer have sway. Now, Molinists think they have an advantage in this respect, but I'm not sure that they do. In fact, I think the advantage is against them. Because according to Molinism, God has indeed specifically planned for and guaranteed the occurrence of every instance of sin and evil. Every instance of sin and evil is part of this picture that God has planned out, and God is making sure that it is enacted down to the finest detail. So if your child is stricken with a horrible disease, God has planned this. This is what, in a sense, God wanted to happen. This is the best thing that could happen in that situation. Now, it's not as bad as for Calvinism, because God has to deal with these counterfactuals, which may have prevented God from getting some better result. Maybe God would have preferred a world in which humans didn't sin at all, but his knowledge of the counterfactuals tells him that if Adam and Eve are placed in the garden, they will eat of the tree of the fruit of good and evil. Okay, so God doesn't have a complete free reign as he does for Calvinism. Still, God is in complete detail has chosen and ordained that this particular sequence of events have come about. And this sometimes puts people in a very humanly agonizing situation. If something terrible has happened in their lives, they ask themselves, why did God plan for this? What greater good can have come about because this terrible evil and terrible suffering happened? And many times, there seems to be no possible answer to this. And this can be an agonizing situation for these people. And for many such people, it's a profound relief to realize, no, this isn't what God wanted to happen. God did not plan for this. God did not ordain that this should happen. God is suffering along with me and my child and my spouse at what has happened. But God is working, God still loves us, and God is working even now to bring about the best possible result from this situation. So I believe that in that respect, open theism has a serious advantage even over Molinism, which of the alternatives seems to be the best alternative.
Especially when it comes to the problem of evil. So let's focus in more on this the difference between Molinism and open theism. Why do you prefer, in the end, open theism over Molinism? What is, like, say, the top? Is it the argument they just gave about the problem of evil, or is it something about, like, is your number one thing just that you don't think these counterfactuals of free truly creedom exist?
I think, yeah, I think the basic and original thing is believing that there aren't these counterfactuals. I know when I first heard of this, and I think it was in college, I first heard the idea, and it immediately didn't seem right to me. It didn't seem plausible to me. It's never seemed plausible to me. And so that, and of course, if that's the case, then the view doesn't even get started. But then of course, inevitably, we start thinking about the implications for divine providence and so on. And it seems to me that here also, although it's a little bit more subtle, here also, I truly think that the real benefit is on the side of open theism. But that's a closer call, I would say.
Well, let's turn now to the Bible and what the Bible has to teach about it. So we're kind of focusing in on open theism versus Molinism right now. And I've got a scripture here that seems to me, and this is one of my objections to open theism, seems to me like this verse pretty clearly supports a Molinist perspective, and that God or Jesus knows these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. So let me go ahead and pull it up on the screen, and I'll get your response to it. So here's the passage from Matthew 11:20-23. I'll just go ahead and read them here. That I've got them on the screen as well. Then he began to denounce the cities where most of his mighty works had been done, because they did not repent. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. So you see that right there. They would have repented. But I tell you, it would be more bearable on the day of judgment for Tyre and Sidon than for you. 23 is another good one. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? You will be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. So it seems like Jesus is, it looks to me like on the face of it, Jesus kind of knows these counterfactuals of, like, what would have happened if these people were in these different circumstances. So it seems to me like passages like this and some others in scripture do seem to promote the view that, philosophically you might have some problems, but biblically it looks like there's a affirmation here of Molinism. What are your thoughts?
Okay. First, I would say that if you come to that passage with Molinism in your mind, it's certainly understandable that you say, there it is. This is Molina and Craig have got it right. Okay. But in fact, there's a lot of intermediate steps you have to go through to get from that passage to Molinism. First of all, you have to assume that there is libertarian free will, and that's not just a given. I mean, many people have denied that. Many Christians have denied that. But assume that that's okay, then how we read the passage itself. Well, one very real possibility is that what you have here is a bit of rhetoric driving home and emphasizing how obvious or how manifest Christ has made his power in these cities, and so how terribly responsible the people are from not having listened to him. In other words, it's a broad contrast to make a point for his viewers or those who are hearing him at that time. So look at the chance you had. Look at the great chance you had to hear my message and realize that I'm from God and that you need to listen to me, and you turned away from it. So it's simple. It's a matter of, if you like, preacherly rhetoric to make that point. Now, Jesus, of course, as a man in his human form, he wasn't there in ancient New Testament times, so he never knew these people in Tyre and Sidon and so on. So how would he know that? Well, maybe God revealed it to him for the purpose of this speech, or maybe for the purpose of this speech, Jesus' human mind is given access to some of his divine knowledge. We don't know. This seems a little artificial to me. But okay, suppose that this is literally a statement about the people in ancient times. Maybe what Jesus knows is that the Sodomites, the state of their minds, of their thinking at that time, was such that necessarily they would have repented if they had had some demonstration similar to what Jesus has given to Bethsaida, for instance. So maybe it's a statement of causal necessitation, not a statement about free will at all. Or maybe it's a statement of probability. Maybe the mind of the ancient Sidonians, the ancient people was such that in all probability, if they had been given a demonstration such as was given by Jesus to these cities that he visited, then they would have repented. The point is, there are a number of different alternatives that would handle this passage without the assumption that Molinism is true. So I think it's way too big a jump. And the same thing will be true in other biblical passages. It's way too big a jump to go from this to, okay, so Molinism is true. I don't find that compelling.
So let me ask you this then. Do you think that it provides any amount of evidence for the truth of Molinism, this passage? Because on the face reading of it, it does seem to at least imply. Would you even agree with that?
If you come to it with Molinism already in mind, it looks like a perfect fit. What I'm saying is there are all of these alternatives. I suppose I mean, since the Molinist interpretation certainly is one possible interpretation, so maybe that gives a little bit of a nudge in favor of Molinism, but I think it's not strong at all.
Okay.
I think it would be very unwise to accept Molinism on the basis of that kind of evidence.
Well, one thing that I definitely agree with is that it could be interpreted in the sense of like preacherly rhetoric. I think that that's actually a sort of good way of looking at what Jesus is trying to do in this verse. So
Okay.
I think I'm open to that. Although I still think personally that it does lend some credence biblically to the Molinist perspective. And in the end, it may not be enough. You may want to look at other passages and kind of weigh everything together. As I'm sure that in the book, open theists have their own set of biblical passages that they can appeal to as well. So why don't we do this? I want to get to this clip because we're coming up on an hour. These things go by so fast. How much time do you have, Dr. Hasker? Are we coming up too quickly here?
I'm free. I can keep going, so
okay.
Don't worry about me.
Okay, everybody's different. Some people, like, including myself, after a little while, my brain just becomes fried doing a live show like this. So why don't we do this? Let's play the clip that I've got queued up from Dr. Craig where he gives his objection to open theism, and we'll get your response to that. So I'll go ahead and play that clip now. Here we go.
There's a theology today that is making inroads into the Christian church called the openness of God. It claims that God cannot and does not foreknow the free acts of human beings, and therefore can only guess at the future. He's said to be a God who takes risks, who gambles, and who sometimes loses. But the passion predictions, such as the ones we've looked at today, show that openness of God theology is wrong. Jesus knew, and knew in sufficient detail, that it couldn't have been guessed exactly what was going to happen to him during that week in Jerusalem. Openness of God theology, therefore, inevitably depreciates the person of Christ. In the story of the triumphal entry, we see disclosed Jesus' sense of lordship as he directs events toward their foreseen ends.
So you've got a lot of thoughts on this. I know that for a fact, but I love that smirk that you're doing. So let me ask you that. So he talks about how on open theism, God is a kind of risk taker. Do you agree with that
True
phrasing?
Yes. John Sanders' great book on providence on open theism is titled The God Who Risks. And we do talk about this. That does not mean that the whole thing is going to come crashing down, but God does not always get what he wants. That's what the Bible says. So that's what we say.
So then, tell me what your response is to Dr. Craig's point here about how Jesus knew what was going to happen to him in sufficient detail.
Bill Craig is a great person, and I have a lot of respect for him. I respect the work that he does. I think he has a tendency to be a little bit too dogmatic sometimes. It kind of offends me that he is saying that we are denigrating the person of Christ. I'll just put this in for a counter jab. Bill Craig holds views about Christology and about the Trinity that are actually formally heretical in terms of the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Chalcedon. So he should sort of watch out for who he's throwing stones at. And about God as gambling, in one place he says, Bill Craig says, God has to play the cards he has dealt. Now the cards he has dealt are all of these counterfactuals of freedom. But here's my question for Bill. Who or what deals this hand of cards to God? God can't deal them to himself. Who else is around to do it? That's the question of what is the basis, what is the grounding for these counterfactuals? But he vastly overstates the case, I think. God has an enormous amount of knowledge and wisdom concerning what will happen in the future. And there's no reason to think that the outcome of Passion Week was unknown to God. God knew the dispositions of all these, the Israelites, including the real rulers of the Jewish people. And God knew the purposes that Jesus had for what he was going to do. This was not a situation where something happened accidentally. So I think he's greatly overstating the case there, and I just don't find it very, very convincing at all.
Okay, yeah, and it was also a very short clip, so perhaps what we can do is set up a dialogue between you and Dr. Craig on the topic.
Yes.
Yeah, that'd be great. We'll see what we can do. Okay, so one last thing that we're going to talk about before we move to some Q&A. We've already had about 4 super chats sent in. We'll get to those in just a second. So tell me some of the top objections that you're familiar with to open theism and why you think they fail.
Well,
and don't say that there's no objections.
No, obviously there are. I mean, there certainly are places in the Bible where it seems like God knows a lot about the future. On the other hand, there are places where it seems to be quite clear that God doesn't know all about the future. In the Old Testament, it says something, I think, 35 times that God repents. God changes his mind. God is sorry that he's done certain things. At one point, he's sorry that he created humans, or he's sorry that he chose the Israelites because they were so disobedient and so on. So I think the biblical picture is complicated, and that would be a long story. It does bother me a little bit that open theism has so little place in the historic tradition of the church, and I think that's true. It's
a recent position.
Well, for any to have any extensive support, you probably have to go back mostly to the 19th and 20th centuries. We go into that, but it doesn't have an extensive historical background. And that bothers me a little bit, because why would so many Christians have been so wrong, as I think they were, for so long? But then Christians have been wrong about a lot of things in the past, and sometimes these errors have persisted for quite a long time. So I don't regard that as decisive, but it's a little bit troubling. And of course, if for your own sense of security, you need the idea that everything is totally guaranteed and nailed down, then this is not going to appeal to you. I think personal temperament does play a role here, but there's no getting around that. There's no avoiding it. So that's mainly what I have to say, I think.
All right, let's get to some questions. We've got several different super chats that have come in. Super chats are ways that you can support this ministry and also get your questions asked during the live stream. Bilbo Baggins, he's a YouTuber, not the Bilbo Baggins, but he's got an interesting comment here. We'll talk about it because the channel's coming up on 100,000 subscribers, which is incredible, insane to me. I don't understand how it's possible. Obviously, the grace of God, but Bilbo Baggins says 100K celebration stream would be a 2-hour Q&A with a panel of Hasker, Swinburne, Rasmussen, Coons, and Craig. That is an awesome idea, although I don't know if we can make it happen with all of these different people. But that is, I want to take a screenshot of this so that I can try to put something together. Because I've been actually thinking, what can we do for the 100K celebration? That seems like a really good idea. So I'll keep that in mind. Thank you for that super chat, Bilbo Baggins. All right, let's move to another one from Bilbo. This one is more on topic. He says, is the principle of alternate possibilities a necessary entailment of open theism, or is open theism compatible with a sourcehood-only view of libertarian free will?
I don't see, of course, I don't see myself much merit in a sourcehood-only view of libertarian free will. It seems to me that what is important about free will is the fact that our lives can be different and the world can be different depending on what we choose. If it's already foreordained, if it's already somehow locked in what the choice is going to be, then I don't think you've got libertarianism worthy of the name. And certainly I think PAP is presupposed by all open theist writers that I know of. And I don't think that the so-called Frankfurt counterexamples disprove PAP, but that may be something we don't want to get into right now.
Yeah, that might be too much for today's stream. Also, I wanted to just get your thoughts, if I can just take an aside here. What do you think about this mug? Can you read it?
Good epistemology covers a multitude of sins. Well, no, it helps, but I think you better repent of your sins, not say, okay, you've got to let me off because I've got a good epistemology. I don't think that's going to work. I don't think God's going to buy that.
Yeah, I think so. A friend of mine, he's an epistemologist, and he just it's a kind of joke. It's not to be taken seriously. Not in the sense of like it covers your actual sins. It covers some intellectual sins, so to speak. Okay, let's get to Sentinel Apologetics. Is that your wife back there?
Yeah.
Oh.
Sorry. Are we still on? Or?
We are still on. We're still on. Can you see me?
Okay, I'm waiting for the next question.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I was distracted by your wife back there. I was hoping to meet her. But all right, here we go. Sentinel Apologetics. He says, can you set up a chat between me and William? And actually, I'm going to do that right now. You've sent in another super chat earlier. Thanks for sending these in, by the way. And so here's your question, and this is your opportunity to talk with Dr. Hasker here. It says, William, God says the Hebrew grammar cannot be ignored. That's a parenthetical phrase. Quote, see, the former things have taken place, and I'm announcing the new things before they spring into being. I'm telling you about them. Isaiah 42:9. So this is obviously supposed to be a biblical objection to open theism.
Right. Yeah, that raises the whole issue of prophecy, and that's a serious, significant topic. I think that, the impression I get from biblical prophecy is not, I, God, am looking into this crystal ball and seeing the future and telling you how it's going to be. What I think biblical prophecy is about is, I am God, I'm the big guy, I'm the God who's going to make things happen in a certain way. And I'm telling you what I'm going to do so that you'll know it was me when it gets done. So I think that in a way what the question presupposes is perhaps a somewhat distorted idea of biblical prophecy. Biblical prophecy is not a matter of God looking into a crystal ball. It's a matter of God who is a powerful agent, actor in history, telling you what he is going to bring about. Now however, God does say this also. He says, okay, if I say to a country, a people or a country, I'm going to bless you and bring good things to you, but then you turn away from me, you turn against me, then I won't do all those good things to you. And if I say to a people or a country, I'm going to bring evil on you because of your sins, and then you repent and turn back to me, I will not bring on you the evil that I've said that I was going to do. In other words, God's prophecies in many, many cases are conditional. They depend on what people do in response. So those are some themes that I would talk about in concerning biblical prophecy. But I admit, this is an issue that needs to be dealt with. I agree.
Fair enough. Okay, here's a question from Maverick Christian. Now, this one is not about the Bible necessarily, but it is about counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. It's a really good question to think about. What about some apparently clear examples of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom? For example, I know my friend, when given the choice, would favor getting 100 million over being tortured.
Well, that's not a libertarian choice. There is no to have a libertarian choice. There has to be some motivation, some possible plausible motivation in both directions. Okay, and I mean, there's no motivation for him to choose to be tortured as opposed to getting $100 million. So, but there are many cases where we know based on people's character, their background, we know what they would choose. But that isn't what middle knowledge is needed for.
Fair enough. All right, here's Barry Anderberg. He said, this is a very interesting question. Is open theism compatible with a block universe? And if so, how?
I would say no. Because in a block universe, you're talking about the temporal block universe. In the block universe, the future already exists. It's just not where we are right now. But if the future exists, there is no possibility for anything to happen different than what already exists in the future. And so there are no alternative possibilities and no free will. That's not the only thing that's wrong with the block universe, but it's definitely not compatible with open theism.
What about growing block?
Pardon me?
What about growing block? Where the block is growing further and further into the future.
Oh, well, yeah, growing block, if it's otherwise okay, it's not a problem because the future is the part that hasn't grown yet. Right.
Mm-hmm. All right, there you go. Okay, so last super chat that we've got for today, and then we'll try to do what we can to close it out. Sometimes these questions come in at the last second. So here's William Keller. He says, on open theism, why doesn't God stop evil? On Molinism, this could be because there is a greater good that will be achieved, but on open theism, God can't know this.
Well, my answer to that is read my book that Cameron so nicely plugged at the beginning. But,
wait, which one? Because I plugged two.
The Triumph of God Over Evil. Yeah.
One more time.
Sell some more copies. Actually, if Molinism says, and I think they're pretty much bound to say, that for every evil that happens, there's a greater good that is possible because of it. That is exactly what puts people in the agonizing situation that I discussed earlier. How, they say, can there be some greater good that is made possible by my child's suffering? Or how can there be some greater good that is made possible by the death of 6 million people during the Holocaust? And sometimes it seems that not only we don't have an answer to that, but no possible answer. There doesn't seem to be any possible answer. And so at that point, it becomes a burden rather than a help to say that.
All right, we've got one more question that's come in from Sentinel Apologetics. He says, William, how does theosis and deification work on open theism?
I think it would work about the way it would on any other view, but I haven't done any extensive work on those topics, so I won't say more about it.
That's fair. That's kind of what struck me as well when I first read that was I don't really see how it would work much different. Okay, all right. Well, I think that's going to do it for us today. We've gone over an hour, which is about the amount of time that we can do on a show like this. We've covered a lot of different topics. To me, what I was so excited about when we were formulating the way that we would do this show today is covering all of the different alternatives and then showing you what it looks like from a philosophical perspective, as an open theist. I just think that that's really valuable. It's really informative. And so I was just really excited about the show today. But thanks for coming on. There's a lot of other topics we could talk about. Even just we've touched on the problem of evil in several different respects today, but it'd be cool to do maybe a whole show about that. Your particular theodicy that you like in your book. So it'd be great to have you back on. Are you open to doing that?
Sometime, sure.
Great. All right, that's going to do it for us today. Thank you guys for tuning in. Don't forget to like and subscribe and do all the things so that the channel can grow. And coming up on 100,000 subscribers, that's crazy. So thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you in the next video.